second lecture in our first session here in Education in the U.S., Ed 552, the online edition. I'm assuming at this point that you've already viewed and listened to the syllabus review and the tour of the website, as you were. This lecture is about the content of the course. The first three sessions deal with the history of education in the United States. We cover a lot of ground in a very small amount of time. And so, like I mentioned in that other lecture, I'm going to do a lot more talking in this session than I will in future sessions. Because what I'm trying to do is give you a very, very basic understanding of where the profession that you've chosen to go into has been since the founding of this country. And we hope that that will help illuminate the present situation. In painting those broad strokes, you'll find that I'm going to come back to some of the things that we cover quickly in these first three lectures. So, for example, the idea of multicultural education. I'll very briefly mention it in the third lecture, and then we'll circle back to it when we actually talk about diversity in schools. We'll actually talk a bit more about the history of multicultural education. So the idea here is some broad strokes to cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time and give you a framework for understanding the past. So just a reminder that if you want the fourth edition of the Rory book for this week, at some point you should have either before right now or very, very soon after listening to this, you should read the introduction in chapter 1 of the Rory book. If you bought the edition in the syllabus, the third edition, then you're reading chapters 1 and 2. For next week, if you bought the fourth edition, you're reading chapters 2 and 3. And if you bought the third edition, you're reading chapters 3 and 4. And then finally, for our last section on the history of education in the United States, if you bought the fourth edition, you're reading chapters 4, 5, and 6. And if you bought the third edition, you're reading chapters 5 and 6. And also in the other lecture, I asked you to go on to the blogs, and as a way of me taking attendance for this first session, I asked you to do your first blog. Remember, you need to do 10 total. You get a point for each. And this first one is the only one that I'm actually going to assign a prompt to. Okay, the other 9, it's just personal reactions to the topics of that week. So this one is an introduction. I'd like you to tell the class who you are. Where do you call home? Describe the schools where you did your primary and secondary education. Tell us maybe in a sentence why you decided to become an educator. What your previous teaching experiences are, if you've had any, and if you haven't, that's totally fine. And where you are at in your education at Sacred Heart. And finally, where do you expect to end up when you complete your degree? Are you going to stay here in Connecticut? Do you hope to go somewhere else? Just an overall, summary of who you are at this exact moment in time. So I'll introduce you to me. I did that briefly in the other lecture, but I'll do it more formally. I'm Tim Patterson. Right now I live in Princeton Junction, New Jersey, and I grew up in New Jersey. I did my schooling. My primary school was a kind of a small farming community type school. I had 30 people in my graduating class. It was K through 8, so no middle school. And then secondary education, we all funneled into a large high school for a bunch of the surrounding towns. And then I did my undergraduate training at Temple University in Philadelphia, where I did my student teaching. I decided to become an educator because I really loved history. And I did not, when I first got into it, realize that loving the content is only half of what you do at the secondary level. The other half has to be loving working with kids. And that second part didn't come as easy to me as I would have liked it to. But once I got the hang of it, I realized how much of a joy it can be to work with young people. It's certainly not a boring job, and every day is different. My previous teaching experiences, before coming here to Sacred Heart, this is my second semester here. For 2 years, I worked as an instructor at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York City, where I was also doing my PhD. Before that, I taught for 3 years in a suburban town right outside of Philly called the Chamonix School District. And before that, I taught for 3 years in my hometown in Freehold, New Jersey. as I said, second semester here at Sacred Heart for me as a full-time assistant professor, excuse me, and I'm not completing a degree. This is where I hoped to end up when I started my degree path about 5 years ago. Okay, so I want you to pause the lecture right here, okay? I'm going to do this a lot in the lectures. I'm going to stop. I'm going to ask you to stop as well. So pause this YouTube clip and head over to our discussion board, and you'll see a discussion prompt by me. So I want you to, without going on, just hit reply and tell me why you believe we should study the institution of education. Why is it important that this course, of all the courses you have to take, why do we also include a course studying the history and current structures of education? So take a few minutes. Remember, the discussion prompts aren't meant to be long at all. Take a few minutes to answer this question. And when you're done, come back to the lecture. Okay, so I'm assuming at this point you've all answered that question. Again, it's an opinionated question, but I'm going to give you some of my reasons why I think it's really important that we study education. Part in that, education in the U.S., and this is particular to the United States, has a very, very local focus, right? We struggle with coming up with a national education policy. Usually policy is set at the district level, not even statewide or countywide, but district-wide. And as a result of that, it's really difficult to compose a big picture from inside one's own classroom, right? I mean, your district experience is local enough, but then you have school experiences and then classroom experiences that really come to define how you understand education. And this is not a critique of it, because I'm one of those people, besides working with my dad on the family farm for a little bit, my only career has been in education, but most of us will only exist in a school environment professionally when you think about it. And so when you spend K through 12 in a school and then you come back to it and you teach, it's very easy to get a narrow understanding of what education in the United States is. So the aim, of course, is to broaden that scope a little bit. At the same time, schools and curricula are contested terrain. Well, what do I mean by that? What I mean is its purposes and its execution, though rarely articulated by teachers, is hotly contested, meaning schools are political sites, especially public schools. What they contribute to a democracy, what kind of citizens we want to come out of public schools, is always up for debate. And sometimes those debates become very heated. We're going to talk about times in our country's history, and they're still going on today, where those debates have become especially heated. I mean, we're a central piece of the culture wars, a piece of political debates. And so, it's important that we understand the institution that we're a part of when that institution is kind of a battlefield for competing ideologies. And as Rory notes, you may have picked up on this, Americans have an uncommon faith, he calls it, in the power of education to cure societal ills. And we'll talk about where that comes from, why Americans have that faith. Not all places see education in that way. In some places, education is there to usher in a new generation, but the idea is to maintain the status quo. Not to fix problems, but to simply maintain things as they are. Okay, and so we're brought to Rory's central concern, which I think is also a central concern of this course, is do schools change society, or does society change schools? Right? That's kind of the big question here, and hopefully you'll be able to answer that question to some degree after the first 3 sessions. Okay, so let's talk about some important concepts that are going to guide the way that we talk about education in the United States. Now, building off of Rory's initial question of do schools change society or does society change schools, it means we kind of have to talk about what we mean by social change. What does that mean? So Rory uses the example of industrialization and urbanization. Right? And of course, this is a topic we're gonna return to. So I won't go into too much detail about it, but this is, the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century. And these are examples of sweeping, massive social change industrialization and urbanization are. These trends fundamentally altered many people's ways of living and relating to one another in monumental ways. And we have a tendency today to look at technology, to look at social media, and say, wow, things are rapidly changing. When I was in school 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was a different place. And that is true. But this period of time, things were changing at a much more accelerated pace than we can even imagine. And these changes also augmented the purposes and methods of educating the younger generation. You have the loss of small communities, new divisions of labor, systematic inequality. They're all examples of social change that would come to impact education in the United States. So this is Rory's example of how social change impacted schools and not the other way around. So let's define some terms. Culture, right? Culture will become an important concept for our discussions about education in the United States. And culture is one of those words that people use every day, and it's rarely defined. And after all, education, whether it's formal education, the job you'll be doing, or informal education, young people watching parents or role models and learning from them, is in part cultural transmission. So of course, this notion of cultural capital is ever present. Cultural capital are certain behaviors and values that are privileged over others. And this is going to play a role in our discussions, in thinking of things like standardized testing, classroom management, multicultural education, most importantly the curriculum, right? What knowledge we choose to value or privilege. And as Rory notes, defining what culture actually is really, really difficult. So once again, what I want you to do is pause the lecture, head back over to the discussion board, and give me your 1 to 2 sentence definition of culture. Okay, so returning to the lecture, more terms that we need to define. The next is social capital. And finding a good graphic to demonstrate this was not easy because, for the most part, if you do like a Google image search for social capital, you're going to find a lot of images from human resources websites because that's where the term social capital is oftentimes used. But social capital, in a nutshell, is basically who you know, right? And you may find when getting a job in education that who you know is very, very important, or who you don't know is very, very important. And then, of course, you have human capital, which is basically what you know, right? Understanding and skills that contribute to economic advancement. So in a lot of ways, human capital is a concept that can be equated with financial prosperity, right? The things you know that are going to allow you to earn a living. Now, these three concepts are different than this idea of ideology. These are concepts, or ideology are concepts, systems, ideas that guide people's interpretations of the world. Now, usually when we say ideology, you think of big ideas like capitalism versus communism, or liberalism, libertarianism, these systems of thought that maybe guide a political viewpoint. That's part of it. Racism, sexism are also ideology. This idea of equity has become a popular ideology in American education, right? Equity refers to the equality of opportunity, not equality, mind you, but equality of opportunity. And equity is an important ideology for us to point out in this first lecture, because equity is what some folks hope schools will provide students with, right? That going to school, getting an education, provides an equality of opportunities in life. Others, however, have argued that schools are agents of the status quo, and therefore, under the guise of equality, giving everyone an equal education, what they've actually done is unleveled the playing field, if we can use that term, right? So equity would try to correct past wrongs. But in the guise of equality, we ignore past wrongs and give every child the same education. It's a debate we can have later, but two ideological standpoints on the purposes of schooling. So let's jump back a couple hundred years and talk about education in the colonies and education in the early republic. Okay, so American schools, we generally think of them as resistive to change, meaning, well, I'll get there in a second, and that's not false. Since around 1916, that is the case, that American schools haven't actually changed a whole lot despite the best efforts of politicians and policymakers. Now, the goal of this first unit of education, though, is to complicate that picture, right? To give you the sense that no, education in the United States has actually gone through many great changes over the last 300 or so years, which shouldn't be surprising. So the grammar of schooling has remained relatively similar. Grammar of schooling is a concept noted on by historians Tyack and Cuban. The grammar of schooling refers to the things that make up the school day, the classroom, tests, the day being divided into discrete units of time. They feel so elemental to what a school is that it seems that American schools have always operated like that. Okay, and that's especially true of the people who are taking this class. That we've all lived in the school system that had the desks in rows and used textbooks and had periods demarked by bells and homework and all of those things that are the grammar of schooling. Thus, after these first 3 sessions, I hope we can answer the question, how did we get here, right? To this point where these things feel so elemental. And spend the rest of the course considering what here is and what here might be in the future. Okay, so going way back. Cotton Mather, there he is, right? Just a note about Cotton Mather, since Rory talks quite a bit about him in that little aside. He uses Cotton Mather as a microcosm for the educational experience in the early republic. Rory mentions, but does not explore, how Cotton and his father, Increase Mather, were instrumental in the hysteria surrounding the Salem witch trials. And it should be noted that yes, they were instrumental. The hysteria likely would not happen without Cotton Mather and Increase Mather. For example, Cotton interviewed the Goodwin sisters, the 4 girls who were making the accusations of witchcraft. He published their accounts far and wide. He published the trial's proceedings, and he also published a letter urging the judges to use spectral evidence. Now, spectral evidence is when witnesses claim witches appear to them in dreams, right? So he said to the judges, he urged them publicly to say, if a witness comes forward and says, this person appeared to me as a witch in my dream, we should consider that the same as, I witnessed this person walk down the street and steal a product from a store, which is pretty over the top if you think about it. And that's part of why I feel the need to blame Cotton Mather in a large part for the hysteria, not the trials, but the hysteria surrounding the trials. And of course, it must also be noted, that's an interesting historical aside, but for our purposes, it must also be noted that Mather is a very specific example of education in the early colonies. He's certainly not the typical parent in colonial America. After all, he wrote so much, that's why we know so much about him. And he wrote much more than most even literate colonists would have. And that's why we know so much about him. So that's a bit about Cotton Mather. Now, the first social change in the New World is, of course, colonialism, the marginalization of the Native American population by the European, mostly English, settlers. Now, it's hard to make generalizations about the colonial population because of the varied reasons for coming to the British colonies. You had religious reasons, that's kind of the most popularly reference reasons, but also for profit, and the differences in topography of the colonies themselves. So think all the way back, maybe you haven't had a U.S. history course since your undergrad, maybe you haven't taken U.S. history since you were in high school, but think about the differences between Plymouth and Jamestown. And because of those differences in typography, the South becomes an export colony, turns to slavery due to a lack of labor, and a wealthy elite determines both the cultural and educational practices. In the North and Middle colonies, they attract family farmers. Religion is an important factor in cultural and educational practices, and we see trade and banking become major industries in the North. So I mentioned these religious roots. The Puritans, who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, would come to define the culture and ultimately many defining features of education in the United States. Most of these early settlers were Protestants. They carried with them the belief that one must have a personal relationship with God. This necessitated the ability to read the scriptures and interpret them for themselves. This also requires literacy and reasoning skills. Hence, this places a new emphasis on education. The level of interaction between the Protestant religion, social change, and education is debated, but historians generally agree that the three worked in some agreement or in concert to influence education during the colonial period and beyond. Many historians have argued over, which of the three factors played the biggest part in the development of an American culture. Formal instruction occurred in local schools, usually for 4 or 5 months at a time. The curriculum was the Bible, prayers, other religious texts and practices. Families who emigrated from Europe with higher education saw the cultural capital accrued at school as significant. The majority of families, however, only saw education as a means of cultivating religious values in the younger generation. And formal education was most common here in New England. For example, Connecticut enacted the first law requiring the establishment of schools. Family, however, was considered the site of education. Schools were meant to supplement the education that occurred at home, not take precedent over it. As such, they were supposed to be a conservative force rather than a force for change. Education was largely voluntary, and laws requiring the settlement of schools were often ignored by communities who did not agree about the significance of schooling. In terms of maintaining religious conformity, early schools were largely a failure. Though religion was still very important in New England, the Puritan way of life largely died out by 1700. This is due in part to the large influx of new immigrants to the New England colonies. Now, after 1700, you have a religious revival called the First, at the time it was simply called the Great Awakening, but there's several others. The Great Awakening, which leads to an increased literacy rates and greater democratization of religious practices in the fast-growing colonies. Right, so this leads to an increased desire for education. You also have the Enlightenment, right? A push for scientific reasoning through Enlightenment literature worked against some religious dogma. Now, of course, these changes were felt mostly at the top of the social pyramid, but they also impacted the function and role of schools. You also had market forces at work. The development of a financial class that I mentioned 2 slides ago, along with the growing trade, increased the value of schooling in the New World. In southern and middle colonies, schooling, or literacy at least, was viewed with skepticism and concern. Governors and other civic leaders worried that schooling would lead to disobedience and social unrest. Of course, those individuals benefited from their schooling and their literacy, but that was an argument that sort of went unquestioned. So as a result, you had low literacy rates in colonies, in southern colonies, than you did in the New England colonies. Of course, it's not entirely clear how much of that is owed to a lack of schooling. Some growth in literacy rates might be owed to economic development. Commercial tasks, such as the purchase of land, required literacy skills. And as literacy became more important, so too did paths to achieving it. One thing is certain: schools alone cannot be given full credit for the growth of literacy in the colonies. Now, for the most part, in the colonies, you did see a lot of informal education. Because work, land, and resources were plentiful, families were large. Children played a large role in the success of those families. They learned the tasks of maintaining a household and farm, essential to survival. Not just prosperity, but quite literal survival. But especially in the northern colonies, you also had apprenticeships. It was common for children to take up these types of apprenticeships with relatives or neighbors. More effective discipline, fostering independence, trade apprenticeships for men were also common, although oftentimes more like internships with little educational value for apprenticeships. We have Ben Franklin on record complaining about that his internships was more like, just running around and assisting the craftsmen rather than actually learning anything. The point is, everyone received some form of education, even if it didn't occur in the classrooms. Now, a brief aside or a note about missionary education, because I wouldn't feel like this was a good Catholic institution if I didn't at least mention this. In the colonies, Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans were forced to live together. Of course, this was done so on the terms of the dominant white Protestant settlers. The colonists generally educated themselves, but there were Catholic missions in Florida and Texas that took to educating Native Americans. We don't know a whole lot about what they did there. There's not much of a documentary record of it, but we know that they focused on teaching the Spanish language to the native or indigenous population, and of course the tenets of Catholicism. Anglicans also sent missionaries to keep their own flock in line while in the New World. So the Anglican missionaries didn't really venture out onto the frontier as much as they did police their own colonies. Okay, so that brings us to the American Revolution. The ideals of the new nation, equality and democracy, required a rethinking of education for citizenship. Many of the founding fathers were skeptical that the common man could be relied on to choose their own leaders. Consider, of course, the Connecticut Compromise, that I would hope those of you that grew up here in the state of Connecticut are familiar with, that established indirect elections of senators appointed by state governments, right? That was a balance between states that wanted full representation based on population and states that wanted an equal number of senators from each state. These types of questions led to a call for public education, but not without controversy. So Thomas Jefferson, there you see on the left, called for free public education in the state of Virginia, though his plan was ultimately rejected. And Benjamin Rush, on the right, wanted to make children into what he called Republican machines. The idea is that they would be good Democrats, lowercase d Democrats, good members of a democratic society, but they weren't supposed to be rule breakers, right? The idea was imparting on them the knowledge of how to exist in a democracy, but also how to behave in a democracy. And Noah Webster, of dictionary fame, called for public education that also cultivated loyalty to the new republic. And of course, the publication of the dictionary was a part of that mission. These calls had the effect of bringing the notion of public schooling to the public's attention and were remarkably different than the previous civic leaders' views on this topic. I mean, consider the way the Southern governors and civic leaders were talking about education before that. Now, this does not lead to practical changes, but it's more of a philosophical shift and a shift in dialogue. Okay, the local nature of education was pretty slow moving at this point. Now, an important note of change is the education of women in the early republic. Women were generally illiterate, save for New England, where they were still largely illiterate, but there were higher levels of literacy in New England for women than in any other part of the country. They couldn't own property or be members of Protestant churches, so there was no need for literacy skills. There are several factors that lead to a shift away from this status quo. First is that women were scarce in the New World, and therefore a valued commodity. The Great Awakening also leads to liberal reforms to the church. Critiquing the old church led to greater participation on the part of women. Also, leading up to the revolution, there appears to be an uptick in female literacy rates, as evidenced by the number of women who were able to sign their own names to wills. You had dame schools, which were private elementary schools taught by women, begin to appear at this time. They taught basic literacy skills along with morality. And then you have the revolution itself. Men leave to fight, left our women in charge of both the home and the business. They had to negotiate contracts, sell land, manage employees, etc. So you have ideological shifts here as a result of this. The most famous, of course, is Abigail Adams' request to John Adams that he don't forget the ladies. The notion that women deserved greater rights took on more weight following the revolution, even if views on women's inferiority didn't actually change. Women were now seen as vital to maintaining the Republican mission of the new nation, hence the term Republican motherhood. Women needed to learn to read in order to teach their children to read and to teach them the principles of democracy. Now, this sort of comes back around in the 19th century with the cult of domesticity, right? Where again, the idea of literate women was not about changing the world. These are not proto-feminists, but rather they're able to simply educate, especially their male offspring. And their female offspring get just enough education to then educate their own children. It's not a liberating feminist principle. It's tied more to redefining women's limited roles in a new nation, but still a radical break from the idea of the educated woman prior to this period of time. Okay, so make sure you've responded to those discussion prompts. Post any questions you have about the course itself to the discussion board before emailing me, and I'll respond to those promptly.